Point of view. You just picked up a vintage Mac like this Power Macintosh 7200 and it has a dead hard drive. Or maybe the hard drive works but you want to upgrade it to something bigger. But like most vintage Macs, this uses one of those pesky, scuzzy hard drives which can be expensive or difficult to procure, especially the 50-pin variety that these Macs use. So what can you do? Well, there's a few modern homebrew solutions on the market today. The most popular of these among vintage Mac users is probably the SCSI to SD, which is a little converter board that you put an SD card into, and it converts it to a 50-pin SCSI interface. And the SCSI to SD and the other similar devices are an excellent solution, but they also cost a little bit of money. And maybe you're cheap like me, and or maybe you're the industrious type like me, and you just so happen to have a modern SCSI hard drive on your hands, like this Seagate Cheetah 10K.7, a modern, semi-modern 2003 37 gigabyte SCSI hard drive. This drive is 30 times larger and 8 years newer than this Mac. It even has a completely different interface. There's not even a Molex connector on here for power. Can you really use a drive like this in a vintage Mac? The answer is yes, and in this video today I will show you how. Over its nearly 40 years of existence, the small computer system interface has gone through many revisions, but they are all backwards compatible down to the original specification. But the biggest difference is in the connector that is used. 3 different connectors were used. The first variety, which is what these Macs use, is a 50-pin connector. Then later they went to a 68-pin connector, and then not long after that they introduced an 80-pin connector, which is what this drive is. And the 80-pin connector is even able to carry power to the drive, which is why there's no Molex connector on this drive. Now, adapting one of the newer SCSI interfaces back to the 50-pin interface is very easy. You literally just need a pin adapter. There's no actual conversion needed. So adapters to convert one of these down to 50-pin are very cheap. To go from 68-pin to 50-pin, an adapter is under $10 on eBay from China. And to go from an 80-pin drive down to 50-pin, I got an adapter for $16 on eBay from China, and here it is. This plugs into the drive, and then you've got your 50-pin connector and a Molex connector to provide power. And then you have some pins there to set the SCSI ID and some other settings. And so physically adapting one of these drives really is as simple as buying one of these boards and just plugging it in. But there's a couple of other obstacles you need to face before you can go ahead and install your Macintosh system software on this drive. The first is a matter of termination. Many newer SCSI hard drives do not have active termination. SCSI is a little more complex than IDE in that each end of a SCSI chain, because you can daisy chain devices on a SCSI bus, up to 15 devices actually with the newer SCSI specification, each end of the chain has to be terminated. Now, way back in the earliest days of SCSI, you would actually do that with a physical terminator, a little device with a SCSI connector on it, not much bigger than the connector itself, that you would just plug in at the end of the SCSI cable, and it would terminate it. And often the circuit board end of the SCSI chain, like the computer motherboard or the SCSI controller, would often have termination built in. A standalone SCSI terminator that you would install is little more than a bunch of resistors tying each of the signal pins to ground. But in the later days of SCSI, when the Macintosh started employing SCSI hard drives, what started to happen was that SCSI hard drives themselves had built-in terminators that you could enable if you so needed to. If not the hard drive, then the optical drive or zip drive or whatever you had had its own terminator that you could enable if you needed to. But in the even later days of SCSI, when they became relegated to servers, like this Seagate Cheetah, which is a server-grade drive, they started not including the built-in terminators on them, and this drive does not have a built-in terminator. And that's an issue. Now, I was originally going to demonstrate this with my Macintosh LC3. Would have been pretty cool with an even older Mac, a 68K Mac. But the problem is that the LC3 has a really simple SCSI cable that goes straight from the motherboard to the one drive that you can have in the LC3. And so while the original Quantum Pro Drive hard drive has built-in termination, and this drive doesn't, I don't have a standalone terminator that I could plug in, but there's also not a place to actually plug a terminator in on the LC3. So I can't use this drive with the LC3 unless I were to switch out the SCSI cable for one with more than 2 connectors and get an actual terminator. With the Power Macs, however, that is not an issue. I don't know which it is, but either the optical drive has onboard termination that's enabled by default, or the Mac's logic board is able to deal with an unterminated chain. I'm not sure which of those two it is, but that's the case with this Power Mac 7200, and so it's not an issue that this drive doesn't have onboard termination. This Mac is able to deal with it just fine. But if your Mac is older, that might be an issue. But of course, if it's something like a Macintosh 2 or a Quadra, it's not much of an issue at all. You just got to grab a SCSI terminator. Issue number 2. Old Macs technically do not allow you to use non-Apple drives. All the hard drives and optical drives and zip drives that were shipped with vintage Macs all had custom firmware on them with a little piece of code to tell the Macintosh system software that that was a drive that was either included with the Mac or otherwise sold by Apple. If you try to put a third-party drive, like this drive, in a Mac, and the drive isn't already formatted to the Macintosh file system, then the Apple HDSC setup, or Apple Drive setup if you're installing a newer version of macOS, will not allow you to format the drive. It won't even detect the drive. It'll simply say that no suitable hard drives were found. But the truth is, that is an Apple-imposed limitation, and it's easily circumvented. People have patched Apple HDSC setup and Apple Drive setup to allow them to detect and format third-party drives. And so what I'm going to have to do with this Mac in this video is use one of those patched versions. I've created a floppy disk of the Disk Tools disk that comes with System 7.5.3, and I've replaced the original version of Apple HDSC setup with the patched version that will be able to detect and format that drive. And after that, it really is as simple as installing the Mac OS, and it'll be fine thereafter. So, how about we go ahead and do just that. There's our factory 1.2 gigabyte Quantum Fireball hard drive. Alright, let's get this show on the road. I've got my Disk Tools floppy disk. heard that hard drive spin up and do a seek test. It is a server grade 10,000 RPM hard drive, but remarkably quiet. Way quieter than the original hard drive, that's for sure. And we are booting our Disk Tools disk. Now I will say there's actually in the Macintosh System Software 7.5.3 floppy disk set, there's actually two Disk Tools disks. Disk Tools 1 is what you use if you have a 68K Mac. Disk Tools 2 is what you use if you have a PowerPC Mac or a 68K Mac that uses IDE hard drives. Although if you have a 68K Mac that uses IDE drives, then this video doesn't even apply to you. You're one of the lucky ones that has a plethora of really cheap storage solutions, either vintage or modern, at your disposal. It's funny, people hate the IDE Macs because their performance was much slower at the time than the SCSI Macs. Not just because they used IDE drives, but because the entire motherboard design was generally very inferior. But I think the IDE Macs are, I really appreciate them, because it's just so much easier to find replacement drives if you need to, or upgrade drives. Alright, we're almost finished booting here. And there we are. Open up our Apple HD-SC setup, which has been patched, and it immediately found the hard drive, and it says the disk is uninitialized or its partition map has become invalid. So I'm going to click initialize. Initializing will erase all of the data. Do you want to initialize the disk? Yes. And there we go. It is now formatting the drive. If the cover was off the computer, we would see the green activity LED on the drive flashing on and off. But yeah. And now we wait for it to do this, which will take about an hour and a half. Actually, when I originally tested this on my 7300, it took an hour and a half. It might take even longer on this 7200. So we're obviously not going to sit here and wait for that. But yeah, it spends about 45 minutes to an hour formatting, and then another 30 to 45 minutes verifying. Because of course this 37 gigabyte hard drive is just preposterously large for a computer from 1995. So it takes a long time to do that. We will step away from this, and we'll come back when it finishes. Alright, it's actually the next day. I went ahead and just went to bed and let this do its thing. And we come here now and it's all done. So let me name the drive. Macintosh HD. And we should get it on the desktop here. There it is. And oh, gotta quit the program. Now, we're not going to get the whole 37 gigabytes. If I open it up here, we got 4 gigabytes. And that's a limitation of the Macintosh file system, HFS. So beginning with macOS 8, I believe 8.1, there was the HFS Plus file system. And that would be able to make use of all 37 gigs. But the rest of the drive doesn't have to go to waste. We can make multiple partitions, as many 4 gigabyte partitions as we want. We can do that right from Apple HD-SC setup, so I'll open that again. And we click Partition and Custom. And from here, there it shows all the free space. At, oh. Oh. I made a mistake. This isn't a 37 gigabyte drive. This is a 72 gigabyte drive. Well, that better explains why it takes so darn long to format. Okay, wow. I could have swore these were 37 gig drives. So we've got our 72 gigabyte drive, and we can make all these partitions if we want. We click the free space, and then we can make a partition as large as we want, up to 4 gigs. I was wrong. The boot partition can't be more than 4 gigabytes, but the rest of the hard drive in the second partition can be as big as whatever. So when I rebooted the computer off camera, then I got a message saying, hey, this partition is uninitialized, do you want to initialize it? So I said yes, and in a few more seconds I had a second partition 64 gigabytes in size. So there you go. Wow, that's funny. This hard drive was twice as big as I thought it was. But there we go. And now the next step is installing the Macintosh system software. So we'll shut down here. All right. And I've got a CD here of System 7.6.1. Quite a loud seek test that hard drive does. And there we go. Now I will say that I could have just booted from the CD from the beginning and just had the patched Apple HDSC setup on a floppy. But for the purpose of the video, I wanted to show doing the whole thing from a floppy disk, just because there are just as many vintage Macs, well, probably more vintage Macs without CD-ROM drives than there are ones with CD-ROM drives. But here we are, we've started into System 761. Which is the operating system that I choose to use on this computer. Oh, that's interesting. Available disk space, 2 gigabytes. It says 4 gigs here. So that might be just a little bug in the system software installation program. We'll assume so. I just want to do a minimum installation. Alright, and it looks like we're done. So I'll quit the installer here, and we will boot into our new System 7.6.1 installation on our 72 gigabyte hard drive. Curious to see how fast it boots. Well, I guess I can't get an accurate reading because it's the first boot, but certainly it was sure as heck wasn't any slower than the original hard drive. I wouldn't be surprised if it's really not that much faster, just because there's going to be a lot of bottlenecks aside from the hard drive itself. CPU speed, bus speed. There's only so much faster you can get when you're on a 10 megabyte per second bus. But here we are. Excellent. Our 4 gigabyte boot partition and our second 64 gigabyte partition. So that's it. One other thing that I would say to be cautious about is that a lot of the smaller Macs, like my LC3, are not built to handle hard drives that draw as much power as a 10,000 RPM server grade drive would draw. As an example, the original 1.2 gigabyte drive out of the 7200 here, it's rated for 680 milliamps on 5 volts and 300 milliamps on 12 volts. Well, for that 72 gigabyte drive, those numbers are 800 milliamps on both buses. As a matter of fact, I looked at the manual, and the peak current, like when the drive is spinning up, could be as much as 2.5 amps on the 5 volt bus, and something like 1 amp on the 12 volt bus. So you add that up, and that's like almost 30 watts of power peak. And when a LC's power supply is only 50 watts total, that's a huge load. My LC3 did power up the 72 gigabyte hard drive without any issues, but I don't know if I would trust it long term, especially when LCs are well known for having slightly fragile power supplies. Not catastrophically so, they're just dying of bad capacitors, but once you replace the capacitors, they're all good. My LC3 for some reason is still working on the original capacitors. I don't know how, when most of them have needed to have their capacitors replaced, but I definitely wouldn't trust a hard drive with such high power demand in a computer like my LC3. It also gets really hot, and the LC3 has a very minimal amount of cooling. The original hard drive doesn't get nearly as warm as the server drive does. So if you're gonna do this, you really ought to stick to a Power Mac or a Quadra or a Macintosh 2, because those computers have bigger, beefier power supplies and bigger, beefier cooling. Or, heck, you could stick a drive in an external SCSI enclosure. I've got an external SCSI hard drive enclosure that can plug into one of these Macs. Got its own built-in power supply, and maybe you just run the hard drive externally if you wanted to. If you had a compact Mac or an LC that you wanted to use one of these drives in, that's a possibility too. But it's just something to think about if you actually try this. But nonetheless, we've shown today that a semi-modern, huge 80-pin SCSI hard drive works just fine in a vintage Mac. And so if you ever had the need or want to change out the original hard drive in such a Mac, and you had one of these drives laying around that came out of a server or a piece of broadcast equipment or medical equipment or what have you, they will work just fine. You just got to take care of the termination issue on the Macs that need it. But for now, the 1.2 gigabyte Quantum Fireball that is original to this computer continues to work just fine, so I'll be putting this drive back in. But there you go. I really hope you enjoyed this video today. Hope maybe you learned something from it. And a big thanks, as always, to my Patreon supporters. This channel is better for their support. And to the rest of you, your viewership is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.